In the depths of the most ancient and hidden texts of Jewish tradition, long before Eve was molded from Adam's side, there existed another woman whose name has been whispered through millennia with a mixture of fear and fascination. Lilith, according to the alphabet of Ben Sira and various Talmudic traditions, was Adam's true first companion, created from the same primordial clay, under the same divine light that witnessed the birth of the first man. But unlike Eve, who would be formed for submission, Lilith emerged from the dust with a rebellious nature, an indomitable force that would challenge not only her earthly companion, but the very celestial order established by the Creator. But this millennial story transcends the limits of ancient mythology to become something much more personal and intimate. If you have arrived here in these silent hours, you probably know that particular sensation of being awake when the world sleeps, with questions that seem to have no answer and an unease that settles in your chest like a cold stone. Perhaps you feel there are parts of you that don't fit into the expectations others have placed on your shoulders. Or maybe you experience that peculiar loneliness of someone seeking their own path in a world that seems to have already traced all possible routes. Lilith's story speaks directly to that part of us that refuses to conform, that questions, that seeks its own truth even when that means walking alone through unknown territories. Tonight, let us allow her millennial narrative to become the balm you need to finally find the peace you have been seeking. According to the oldest accounts, when God formed Adam from the dust of the earth, he immediately recognized that it was not good for man to be alone. But the first divine attempt to create a companion did not result in the docile Eve we know from canonical scriptures. Instead, from the same red and moist earth from which Adam had emerged, Lilith was molded, a woman of such intense beauty that some texts describe her as capable of blinding the lesser angels who dared to gaze upon her directly. Her hair fell like midnight cascades over shoulders that had never known humiliation, and her eyes reflected the same spark of rebellion that had led Lucifer to question celestial authority. From the moment she opened her eyes in the Garden of Eden, Lilith intuitively understood that she had been created as an equal, not as a subordinate, and this understanding would define every moment of her earthly existence. The first days in paradise passed with palpable tension between the two first human beings. While Adam expected Lilith to naturally assume a role of submissive companionship, she explored the garden with voracious curiosity, naming creatures and plants with an authority that rivaled that of her male companion. The disputes began subtly, as disagreements about which fruits to gather or which paths to take during their evening walks, but soon escalated to more fundamental confrontations about the nature of their relationship and their respective roles in creation. The most famous conflict, according to the alphabet of Ben Sira, arose in the context of their physical intimacy, when Lilith categorically refused to lie beneath Adam during the sexual act, arguing that both had been created from the same clay and therefore possessed the same dignity and authority. This refusal was not simply a matter of physical position, but a profound declaration about her egalitarian nature and her rejection of being treated as inferior or subordinate in any aspect of her existence. The escalation of conflict between Adam and Lilith reached proportions that began to concern the celestial hosts. The observing angels reported that the Garden of Eden, designed as a paradise of perfect harmony, had become a verbal battlefield where two equally powerful forces constantly clashed. Adam, frustrated by his companion's persistent resistance, began to appeal directly to the Creator, complaining that the woman who had been given to him did not fulfill her purpose of being a suitable helper. His prayers became increasingly urgent, asking God to intervene to make Lilith recognize her appropriate place in the hierarchy of creation. Meanwhile, Lilith developed an increasingly deep connection with the darker and more mysterious aspects of the garden, exploring corners where not even Adam ventured, and establishing communication with creatures that others would consider dangerous or impure. It was as if her rebellious nature naturally attracted her to everything that challenged established norms and conventional expectations. The final breaking point came during a particularly intense confrontation where Adam, backed by what he perceived as divine authority, demanded that Lilith submit to his will in all aspects of their shared life. Lilith's response was as dramatic as it was definitive. She pronounced the sacred and ineffable name of God, the tetragrammaton that only the most powerful beings knew, and whose articulation granted almost unlimited power to whoever pronounced it correctly. The moment those sacred syllables left her lips, wings sprouted from her back like explosions of shadow and fire, and she rose toward the sky with terrible grace, leaving behind not only Adam, but the entire structure of creation as it had been originally conceived. Her flight was not a cowardly escape, but a declaration of absolute independence, a total refusal to live under terms she considered degrading and unacceptable to her fundamental nature. Lilith's departure from Eden sent shock waves throughout all of creation. God, facing the first human rebellion in history, immediately sent three of his most powerful angels in search of the fugitive woman. Sanoi, Sansanoi, and Samanjaloff were charged with the mission of finding Lilith and convincing her to return to the garden, with specific orders to use both persuasion and threat if necessary. The three archangels found her established beside the Red Sea, a region that was already then known for its treacherous currents and waters that changed color according to the tides, reflecting moods that ranged from serene blue to blood red. When the celestial emissaries reached her, Lilith had already begun her transformation into something that transcended her original human nature, developing powers and knowledge that placed her in a completely different category of being. The conversation between Lilith and the three angels was epic in its scope and implications. The celestial messengers explained the consequences of her rebellion, warning her that her refusal to return to Eden would result in severe punishments not only for her, but for all her future offspring. They promised her that if she insisted on her rebellion, 100 of her children would die each day as the price of her disobedience, a curse that would extend through generations until the end of time. But Lilith, already completely transformed by her contact with forces that existed beyond the limits of the earthly paradise, responded with a proposal that demonstrated both her power and her fundamentally altered nature. She would accept the daily death of her descendants as the price of her freedom, but in exchange, she would claim her own dominion over certain aspects of human experience, particularly those related to newborns, women in childbirth, and all those who existed on the margins of ordered and conventional life. With this terrible pact sealed, Lilith began her new existence as an entity that inhabited the liminal spaces between the material world and the spiritual realms. She was no longer simply the first woman, but something much more complex and powerful, the mother of demons, the queen of the night, the patron of all those who refused to conform to the roles that had been assigned to them by society or even by divinity itself. Her dwelling beside the Red Sea became her own kingdom, where the rules of Eden did not apply, and where she could freely explore the limits of her capabilities and desires without the restriction of external expectations. It was a place of absolute freedom, but also of a loneliness that few could understand or endure for long. During her centuries beside the Red Sea, Lilith developed relationships with entities that existed completely outside the order of traditional divine creation. It is said that she became the consort of Samael, one of the most powerful fallen angels, and that together they engendered a race of demons that would carry her rebellion to every corner of the created world. But beyond these romantic and procreative associations, Lilith dedicated herself to the deep study of arts and knowledge that had been forbidden or kept secret since the first days of creation. She mastered magic related to sacred names, learned to manipulate the currents of energy that flowed between the visible and invisible worlds, and developed an understanding of feminine nature that went far beyond what any sacred text had contemplated until then. As centuries passed and humanity multiplied and spread across the earth, Lilith's influence began to manifest in increasingly subtle but penetrating ways. Popular traditions of various cultures began to preserve echoes of her story, though often distorted or fragmented. In Mesopotamia, she was known as Lilith, a female demon associated with storms and diseases, while in other Mediterranean cultures, she appeared under different names, but always with similar characteristics. A woman of supernatural power who challenged established norms and who represented both the freedom and the danger of living completely, according to one's own terms. These cultural manifestations of her influence were not simply superstitions or primitive fears, but unconscious recognitions of a force that had been present since the first moments of human experience. One of the most persistent manifestations of Lilith's presence in human culture has been her association with simultaneous protection and danger for children, particularly newborns. Jewish traditions developed elaborate amulets and rituals designed to protect babies from Lilith's influence during their first weeks of life, when they were considered most vulnerable to her attention. But these same rituals implicitly recognized her power and her right to certain dominion over these aspects of human experience. It was as if humanity had reached a tacit agreement with this primordial force. They recognized her authority in certain territories in exchange for her respecting certain limits and not completely interfering with the established order of family and social life. The figure of Lilith also became a powerful symbol for women who felt trapped by the limitations of traditional roles, or who experienced impulses toward independence and self-determination that were considered inappropriate or dangerous by their societies. Throughout history, there have been women who have found in Lilith's story an alternative model of femininity, one that did not require submission or conformity, but celebrated strength, intelligence, and the will to live according to one's own terms, even when that meant facing severe consequences. This identification with Lilith was not necessarily an adoption of demonic or destructive practices, but rather a recognition that there were aspects of feminine nature that could not be completely domesticated or contained within conventional social structures. The Kabbalistic tradition developed even more complex and nuanced interpretations of the figure of Lilith, seeing her not simply as an evil demon, but as a representation of necessary but problematic aspects of human spiritual experience. In this perspective, Lilith represented the dark side of the Shekinah, the feminine presence of the divine, and her rebellion was not simply destructive, but served a broader cosmic purpose by maintaining a balance between opposing forces within creation. Her existence outside Eden provided a necessary counterpoint to the perfect harmony of paradise, creating the dynamic tension that allowed growth, change, and spiritual evolution. Without Lilith and her refusal to conform, some Kabbalists argued, creation would have remained static and incomplete, lacking the complexity and depth that can only arise from the conflict and resolution of opposing forces. In the most esoteric treatises of the Kabbalah, Lilith is described as possessing a beauty that remains intact and powerful despite the millennia that have passed since her departure from Eden. This beauty is not merely physical, but represents a more fundamental attractiveness, the seduction of absolute personal freedom, the temptation to live without restrictions imposed by others, even when those restrictions might be justified by divine wisdom or social necessity. It is a dangerous beauty because it appeals to deep impulses in human nature that, if followed without moderation or wisdom, can lead to destruction, both personal and collective. But at the same time, it is a necessary beauty because it keeps alive the possibility of radical transformation and the rejection of life conditions that are truly degrading or limiting in unjust ways. Lilith's relationship with human sexuality has been another consistent aspect of her mythology across different cultures and historical periods. She is not described simply as a promiscuous or destructive sexual entity, but as a representation of aspects of feminine sexuality that challenge traditional norms about passivity, modesty, or restriction. In her original refusal to adopt a subordinate position during the sexual act with Adam, Lilith established a precedent for the idea that women had the right to be active and equal participants in physical intimacy, with their own desires and preferences that deserved respect and consideration. This perspective was revolutionary in contexts where women were expected to be passive recipients rather than active participants in sexual experience. But Lilith's sexuality goes beyond questions of position or activity to touch deeper aspects of the connection between physical intimacy and spiritual power. In many traditions, she is described as capable of visiting men in their dreams, not simply to tempt or destroy them, but to awaken aspects of their nature that had been dormant or repressed. These nocturnal visits were understood as opportunities for both growth and danger, depending on how the individual responded to the impulses and revelations that arose from these encounters. It was as if Lilith served as a mirror that reflected back the deepest desires and ambitions of those she encountered, forcing them to confront aspects of themselves that they might have preferred to keep hidden. At this moment of our nocturnal journey, let me ask you something with the gentleness your search deserves. How many dawns have you spent feeling as if you carry within you a voice that no one else seems to understand? that part of you that resists fitting into the molds that others have defined as appropriate or safe. That restlessness you feel when you look at your life and wonder if you're really living according to your own convictions or simply following a script that someone else wrote for you. Lilith's story touches something very real in that part of us that yearns for authenticity but also fears the consequences of being completely ourselves. I invite you to share in the comments what brought you to this story tonight. Was it that sensation of searching for models of strength that go beyond silent resignation? Or perhaps that need to find validation for impulses toward independence that others in your life don't understand or support? When you write about your experience, you not only release something from the weight you've been carrying in silence, but you also offer companionship to another person who might be facing the same internal dilemmas. Sometimes, knowing that someone else has felt that tension between conformity and authenticity is the first step toward finding the courage to honor your own nature. Your experience is valid, your questions matter, and every story shared here creates a network of understanding that can sustain those who are still finding their way toward inner peace. As Lilith's story spread across different cultures and eras, it also began to evolve and adapt to the specific needs and concerns of each society. During the Middle Ages, Christian scholars who found references to her in Jewish texts initially tried to incorporate her into their own cosmologies as a minor demon or a particular aspect of satanic temptation. However, this simplified interpretation could not completely contain the richness and complexity of her original mythology, and gradually more sophisticated understandings emerged that recognized in Lilith a force that transcended simple categories of good and evil. Medieval Christian mystics often saw in Lilith's story an allegory about the importance of individual free will and the dangers of both excessive submission and rebellion without limits. For these thinkers, the tension between Lilith and Adam represented the eternal conflict between different ways of understanding the relationship between human will and divine authority. Her eventual departure from Eden was not seen simply as a punishable act of disobedience, but as an illustration of the complex moral and spiritual dynamics that arise when different conceptions of good enter into irreconcilable conflict. Islamic texts also developed their own versions of the figure of Lilith, though frequently under different names and with specific cultural nuances. In these traditions, she often appears as a powerful jinn who had existed before the creation of humans and who possessed knowledge and capabilities that could be both beneficial and dangerous for those who interacted with her. The Islamic tradition tended to emphasize more her role as guardian of hidden knowledge and as an entity that could serve as a teacher for those who sought wisdom beyond the limits of ordinary human experience, though always with clear warnings about the risks inherent in such spiritual searches. This persistence of the figure of Lilith through so many different religious and cultural traditions suggests that she represents something fundamental about human experience, particularly feminine experience, that cannot be completely suppressed or ignored by any belief system. Even in societies where women had few opportunities for independent expression or self-determination, stories of Lilith kept alive the possibility of a femininity that was not defined primarily by relationship to masculine authority figures. It was a femininity that could exist by itself, that could make decisions based on its own values and desires, and that could accept the consequences of those decisions without regret or subsequent submission. In the context of medieval literature, Lilith frequently appeared in narratives where she served as a figure of dangerous wisdom, someone who possessed knowledge that could profoundly transform those who received it, but who could also destroy those who were not prepared to handle such revelations. These stories typically presented encounters between Lilith and heroes, or spiritual seekers who were on missions of some kind, whether spiritual, intellectual, or moral. The encounters were always tests of character as much as opportunities for personal growth, and the outcome depended largely on whether the individual could recognize and respect the power that Lilith represented without trying to dominate or underestimate it. One of the most significant evolutions in Lilith's mythology during this period was the development of traditions that described her not as an inherently malevolent entity, but as a natural force that could manifest in constructive or destructive ways, depending on how it was approached and understood. This more nuanced perspective recognized that the aspects of rebellion, independence, and pursuit of personal power that Lilith represented were not necessarily negative in themselves, but became problematic only when expressed in ways that completely ignored the needs and rights of others, or when pursued without wisdom, moderation, or consideration for broader consequences. During the Renaissance, when renewed interest in classical and Hermetic texts led to a reconsideration of many mythological figures, Lilith experienced something like a partial rehabilitation in certain intellectual circles. Scholars who studied the origins of religious traditions began to see in her story not simply a moral fable about the dangers of feminine disobedience, but a more complex allegory about the eternal tension between individual freedom and social harmony. Some philosophers of the period argued that Lilith's story represented an early recognition that true wisdom required the balancing of opposing forces rather than the suppression of any important aspect of human experience. Renaissance artists occasionally included representations of Lilith in works that explored themes of femininity, power, and spiritual transformation. These visual representations often emphasize both her beauty and her untamed nature, presenting her as a figure who was simultaneously attractive and formidable, desirable, and dangerous. The visual tension created by this combination of apparently contradictory qualities reflected the inherent complexity of her mythology and suggested that the realities she represented could not be easily categorized or contained within simple conceptual frameworks. Alchemical treatises of later centuries frequently included references to Lilith as a representation of the feminine aspect of the process of spiritual transformation, particularly those aspects that involved the dissolution of existing structures before new forms could emerge. In this alchemical interpretation, Lilith's rebellion against the established order of Eden was seen as a necessary step in their process of spiritual evolution, a recognition that true growth often requires the willingness to abandon familiar forms of existence in favor of unknown but potentially more complete and satisfying possibilities. The Hermetic tradition developed elaborate correspondences between Lilith and various aspects of the human psyche, seeing her as a personification of impulses toward individualization and personal authenticity. that could conflict with social demands for conformity, but were essential for the full development of personality. In this perspective, encounters with the energy of Lilith, whether in dreams, meditation, or real-life experiences, were opportunities to explore aspects of one's own nature that might have been repressed or denied due to social pressure or personal fear. Such encounters were considered both promising and risky, requiring care and discernment to navigate successfully without falling into destructive extremes. As centuries advanced toward the modern era, the figure of Lilith began to resonate in new ways with social movements and philosophies that questioned traditional structures of authority and power. Early advocates for women's rights frequently found in her story a historical precedent for feminine resistance to restrictive roles and for insistence on fundamental equality between the sexes. Although few openly adopted Lilith as a direct political symbol, her story provided a language and conceptual framework for discussions about feminine autonomy that had been difficult to articulate using only traditional biblical references or purely secular arguments. 20th century psychologists and psychoanalysts developed interpretations of the figure of Lilith that saw her as a representation of aspects of the feminine psyche that had been historically repressed or pathologized. Carl Jung, in particular, wrote about archetypes similar to Lilith as manifestations of what he called the anima, in its most independent and powerful aspects of femininity that were not defined by caregiving or supportive roles, but by creativity, strength, and self-determination. These psychological interpretations suggested that encounters with Lilith-type figures in dreams or fantasies might represent contact with undeveloped aspects of personality that sought expression and integration in conscious life. Modern feminist interpretations of the figure of Lilith have tended to emphasize her importance as one of the first models of feminine resistance to patriarchal subordination. Writers like Judith Plaskow and other feminist theologians have argued that Lilith's story represents a very early recognition that gender-based power structures are not natural or inevitable, but social constructions that can be resisted and transformed. In this interpretation, Lilith's departure from Eden is not a story of divine punishment for disobedience, but a narrative about the importance of maintaining personal dignity, even when that requires significant sacrifices. The feminine spirituality movement of recent decades has developed rituals and practices that honor Lilith as a deity or spiritual force in her own right, not simply as a demon or a figure of moral warning. These practices typically emphasize aspects of her mythology related to personal empowerment, sexual and spiritual creativity, and the importance of maintaining healthy boundaries in relationships. For many women, working with Lilith's energy has become a way to reconnect with aspects of femininity that were devalued or suppressed in their traditional religious or cultural educations. Contemporary scholars of comparative religion have noted fascinating parallels between the figure of Lilith and powerful feminine deities from other traditions that also represent aspects of femininity that are not domesticated or contained within conventional social roles. Figures like Kali in Hinduism, Sekhmet in ancient Egyptian religion, or various manifestations of the mother goddess in European pagan traditions share certain characteristics with Lilith. They are simultaneously creators and destroyers, protectors and dangerous, beautiful and terrible. This cross-cultural consistency suggests that Lilith represents something archetypal about feminine experience that transcends specific cultures or particular historical periods. Contemporary literature has seen a flourishing of reinterpretations and new versions of Lilith's story that explore her narrative from perspectives that go far beyond traditional moral or theological interpretations. Novelists and poets have created versions of her story that present her as a tragic heroine, a spiritual revolutionary, a goddess of personal transformation, and a variety of other roles that reflect contemporary concerns about gender, power, spirituality, and individual freedom. These modern reinterpretations often emphasize the emotional and psychological complexity of her decision to leave Eden, exploring both the pain and the liberation that would have accompanied such a radical act of self-determination. In the realm of contemporary psychology, some therapists have begun working with clients who report dreams or experiences involving figures similar to Lilith, interpreting these encounters as manifestations of aspects of personality that seek greater expression or recognition. This work typically focuses on helping individuals explore ways to integrate impulses toward independence and authenticity in ways that are healthy and constructive rather than destructive to themselves or their relationships. It is a process that requires considerable care and wisdom, given the potential for both growth and damage when dealing with such powerful and potentially disruptive energies. Contemporary artists have created a wealth of visual representations of Lilith that reflect modern interpretations of her significance. These works often emphasize her beauty and power, while also acknowledging the aspects of her mythology that are challenging or unsettling. Many contemporary depictions present her as a figure of empowerment rather than evil, but they typically also recognize that the powers she represents require wisdom and moderation to be exercised effectively. The result is often a visual tension that reflects the emotional complexity of her story and the challenging questions it raises about the relationship between personal freedom and social responsibility. If you've reached this point of our nocturnal journey, it is because something deep in Lilith's story resonates with your soul in search of answers. This channel exists precisely for spirits like yours, who seek in the quietude of dawn not only entertainment, but understanding, validation, and a path toward inner peace. Here you will find each week new narratives that embrace both the light and shadow of human experience, stories that do not judge your complexity, but celebrate it as a natural part of spiritual growth. By subscribing, you join a silent community of nocturnal seekers who understand that the deepest answers often come when the outer world finally quiets and we can hear the wisdom that whispers from the oldest traditions. Do not let another night pass feeling that you are alone in this search for authenticity and understanding. These stories are here to accompany you until sleep comes, and your soul no longer needs to carry alone the weight of being different in a world that often privileges conformity over truth. In contemporary therapeutic contexts, some professionals have begun incorporating elements of Lilith's mythology into work with clients who struggle with issues related to personal boundaries, self-assertion, and the tension between personal needs and social expectations. This work typically involves helping individuals explore healthy ways to express impulses toward independence and authenticity without falling into patterns that are destructive to themselves or their relationships. It is a delicate balance that requires considerable skill and wisdom to navigate effectively. But for many people, connecting with archetypal figures like Lilith can provide a framework for understanding and integrating aspects of their personality that previously felt confusing or problematic. The figure of Lilith has also found expression in various forms of contemporary spiritual practice that combine traditional and innovative approaches to working with archetypal energies. Some practitioners develop personal relationships with Lilith as a spiritual guide or mentor, particularly in areas related to setting boundaries, reclaiming personal power, and resisting pressures to compromise important values for social acceptance. These practices typically emphasize the importance of approaching such powerful archetypal energies with respect, caution, and clear intentions, recognizing that they can be both tremendously helpful and potentially overwhelming if not handled skillfully. The academic study of Lilith's mythology has also evolved significantly in recent decades, with scholars approaching her story from disciplines such as religious studies, women's studies, psychology, anthropology, and comparative mythology. This scholarly work has helped illuminate the ways her story reflects broader patterns in human culture related to gender roles, power dynamics, spiritual development, and the tension between individual desires and social cohesion. Many contemporary scholars emphasize that understanding figures like Lilith requires moving beyond simple moral judgments to appreciate the complex psychological and spiritual realities they represent. In the context of relationship counseling, some therapists have found that Lilith's mythology provides useful metaphors for discussing issues related to equality, mutual respect, and the importance of both partners in a relationship maintaining their individual identity and autonomy. The story of her conflict with Adam over issues of dominance and submission resonates with many contemporary couples who struggle with similar dynamics, and exploring these themes through the lens of mythological narrative can sometimes provide insights that are difficult to access through more direct approaches. For many people who encounter Lilith's story for the first time as adults, one of the most striking aspects is how it challenges conventional notions about feminine virtue and appropriate behavior for women. In cultures where women have been traditionally expected to be primarily nurturing, accommodating, and supportive, the image of a woman who chooses exile and independence over submission can be both inspiring and unsettling. This emotional complexity reflects the real challenges many women face as they navigate between desires for authentic self-expression and pressures to fulfill traditional roles and expectations. The story also raises important questions about the nature of relationships and what constitutes healthy partnership versus unhealthy dominance. Lilith's insistence on equality in her relationship with Adam speaks to contemporary concerns about mutuality, respect, and the importance of both partners having agency and voice in important decisions. At the same time, her ultimate choice to leave rather than continue working toward compromise raises questions about when persistence in trying to resolve conflicts becomes counterproductive and when separation might be the healthiest option for everyone involved. One of the most intriguing aspects of contemporary interpretations of Lilith's mythology is how they engage with questions about the relationship between sexuality and spirituality. Traditional religious perspectives often treated these as separate or even opposing domains, but the figure of Lilith suggests a more integrated understanding where sexual expression and spiritual development are interconnected aspects of human experience. This perspective has influenced various forms of contemporary spiritual practice that seek to honor and integrate rather than suppress or sublimate sexual energy as part of spiritual growth. The psychological implications of Lilith's story also extend to questions about the development of healthy self-esteem and personal identity. Her refusal to accept a subordinate role speaks to the importance of maintaining self-respect and dignity, even in difficult circumstances, while her willingness to accept significant consequences for her choices highlights the reality that authentic living often requires sacrifice and courage. For many people, particularly those who have struggled with people-pleasing tendencies or difficulty asserting themselves, the Lilith archetype can provide inspiration and validation for developing greater self-advocacy skills. In educational contexts, some teachers and professors have incorporated Lilith's story into courses on literature, religious studies, women's studies, and psychology as a way to engage students with complex questions about gender, power, identity, and moral decision-making. The story's richness and ambiguity make it particularly useful for encouraging critical thinking and discussion, as students often find themselves grappling with questions that don't have simple or clear-cut answers. This process of wrestling with moral and spiritual complexity can be valuable preparation for the kinds of challenging decisions that adults regularly face in their personal and professional lives. The influence of Lilith's mythology can also be seen in various forms of contemporary activism and social change movements. While few activists explicitly invoke her name, many of the themes associated with her story, equality, resistance to unjust authority, the willingness to accept personal cost for maintaining integrity, appear regularly in movements for social justice and human rights. Her example provides a historical precedent for the idea that sometimes progress requires individuals who are willing to challenge established systems, even when doing so involves significant personal risk. For mental health professionals, the Lilith archetype sometimes appears in client dreams, fantasies, or artistic expressions as a representation of aspects of personality that are seeking greater integration or expression. Working skillfully with such material typically involves helping clients explore what these archetypal appearances might represent about their own developmental needs, while also maintaining healthy boundaries and avoiding inflation or identification with powerful archetypal energies. It is delicate work that requires considerable training and experience to handle effectively. The contemporary revival of interest in Lilith's mythology also reflects broader cultural shifts toward greater acceptance of feminine power and authority, as well as growing recognition of the limitations and potential harmfulness of traditional gender role expectations. As society continues to evolve toward greater equality and mutual respect between genders, figures like Lilith serve as reminders that these developments represent not entirely new innovations, but rather returns to more ancient understandings of feminine potential and dignity that existed before they were suppressed by later cultural developments. In artistic communities, Lilith has become a popular figure for exploring themes related to creative autonomy, artistic integrity, and the tension between commercial success and authentic expression. Many artists identify with her willingness to sacrifice security and acceptance to maintain creative independence, and her story provides a powerful metaphor for the challenges creative people face when their vision conflicts with popular taste or market demands. This artistic identification with Lilith often emphasizes the importance of staying true to one's creative vision, even when doing so involves financial or social costs. The therapeutic work that draws on Lilith's mythology often emphasizes the importance of integration rather than identification with archetypal energies. While the qualities that Lilith represents, independence, self-assertion, creative power, sexual authenticity, are valuable and necessary aspects of healthy psychological development. Becoming too identified with any archetype can lead to imbalance and potential problems in relationships and other areas of life. Skillful therapeutic work helps individuals access and express these qualities in ways that are appropriate to their circumstances and supportive of their overall well-being. For many people who feel drawn to Lilith's story, one of the most healing aspects is the validation it provides for experiences of feeling different, rebellious, or out of step with conventional expectations. In cultures that often pressure individuals to conform to narrow definitions of acceptable behavior, encountering a mythological figure who represents the value and necessity of nonconformity can be profoundly affirming. This affirmation can be particularly important for individuals who have been criticized or rejected for expressing aspects of their personality that others find challenging or uncomfortable. The story also provides insights into the complex relationship between love and freedom, and how these sometimes can come into conflict in ways that require difficult choices. Lilith's departure from Eden represents not a rejection of love itself, but rather a recognition that some forms of relationship, no matter how well-intentioned, can become constraining in ways that ultimately damage both partners. This insight has relevance for contemporary individuals who find themselves in relationships where they feel pressured to suppress important aspects of their identity to maintain harmony or avoid conflict. Contemporary spiritual directors and counselors sometimes work with individuals who report dreams or experiences involving Lilith-like figures, interpreting these as invitations to explore aspects of spiritual development related to personal empowerment and authentic self-expression. This work typically emphasizes the importance of approaching such powerful archetypal energies with proper preparation, support, and guidance, as they can catalyze significant changes in a person's life and relationships. The goal is usually not to become like Lilith, but rather to integrate the healthy aspects of what she represents, while avoiding the potential pitfalls of her more extreme expressions. In academic conferences and scholarly publications, there has been increasing discussion about the ways Lilith's mythology intersects with contemporary issues such as domestic violence, workplace harassment, and other forms of gender-based oppression. Some scholars argue that her story provides important insights into the psychology of resistance and the factors that enable some individuals to maintain their dignity and self-respect even in highly oppressive circumstances. Others point out that her story also illustrates potential costs of such resistance, and the importance of having support systems and alternative resources when choosing to challenge unjust situations. The influence of Lilith can also be seen in various forms of contemporary women's literature, where authors create characters who embody similar qualities of independence, strength, and willingness to challenge conventional expectations. These literary characters often face similar dilemmas to those confronted by Lilith: how to maintain personal integrity while also navigating complex social relationships and responsibilities. The resolution of these dilemmas varies widely among different authors and works, reflecting the ongoing cultural conversation about how to balance individual authenticity with social connection and responsibility. For individuals who work in helping professions such as counseling, social work, or ministry, the Lilith archetype sometimes appears as a representation of the helper's own needs for boundaries, self-care, and resistance to pressures to give more than is sustainable or healthy. Professional helpers can be particularly susceptible to patterns of overgiving and self-sacrifice that, while well-intentioned, can ultimately lead to burnout and reduced effectiveness. The Lilith archetype can serve as a reminder of the importance of maintaining professional boundaries and attending to one's own needs as well as those of clients or community members. In discussions about parenting and child development, some contemporary perspectives draw on Lilith's mythology to emphasize the importance of raising children, particularly daughters, with a strong sense of personal agency and self-worth. This approach suggests that while teaching cooperation and social skills is important, it is equally crucial to help children develop the ability to recognize and resist situations where they are being asked to compromise their fundamental dignity or well-being. The goal is to raise individuals who can maintain healthy relationships while also being able to protect themselves from exploitation or abuse. As we reach the end of this nocturnal exploration through the complex and fascinating mythology of Lilith, we find ourselves confronted with timeless questions about identity, relationship, freedom, and the courage required to live authentically in a world that often demands conformity. Her story, preserved through millennia in various forms across different cultures, continues to speak to contemporary experiences of individuals who struggle with similar tensions between personal truth and social expectations. Whether we encounter her as demon, goddess, literary figure, or psychological archetype, Lilith represents aspects of human experience that are both powerful and potentially dangerous, both necessary for healthy development and requiring wisdom and restraint to integrate successfully. Perhaps the most enduring gift of her mythology is the reminder that authenticity often requires courage, that healthy relationships depend on mutual respect rather than domination, and that sometimes the most loving thing we can do for ourselves and others is to honor our deepest truths, even when doing so involves significant sacrifice. In a world that continues to grapple with questions about gender equality, personal freedom, and the balance between individual expression and communal harmony, the ancient story of Lilith remains remarkably relevant and continues to offer insights that can guide us toward greater wisdom, compassion, and understanding. As the night deepens and these words find their way to your weary but seeking heart, may you find in Lilith's story not a call to rebellion, but permission to be fully yourself, with all the complexity, strength, and beauty that such authenticity requires. May her example inspire you toward relationships that honor your full dignity, toward choices that reflect your deepest values, and toward a life that, though challenging, is ultimately true to who you really are. And may you find, in these quiet hours before dawn, the peace that comes from knowing you are not alone in your journey toward wholeness, understanding, and authentic connection with yourself and with the mystery we call life.